So allow me to go directly with the first one about the markets update. So I will update very quickly about the equity market performance and fixed income. Specifically, it's the corporate bond market, especially with the new regulation just coming out, the Decree 65. First, about the equity markets. You may heard about the very low liquidity, but to us, look at the figure number 1. So the markets still, I think, very okay. So daily liquidity in the August is about 17,000 per day, and this September, our data indicated around this a little bit lower number. But taking out the margin of the leverage trading, I think this market is running okay. And because if you look at the figure number 2, despite the low sentiment from the retail investor, so it means the institutional investor and the market is still going well in terms of the liquidity. And having said that, the securities company who rely on retail, domestic retail investor will be affected more than the company who serve the foreign, especially the institutional investor. And the sentiment of the retail investor recently very low, especially from the early 2022. If you look at the figure number 2, so they're trading very low liquidity and selling almost all the month and the week. So and remember, the market is a zero-sum game. So that means the institutional investor, especially the foreign and prop trading by securities company, they are the net buyer. Of course, the turnover is much smaller. So that's I think that's the liquidity and the performance, or liquidity and the participation from the retail investor. Those are the 2 very key important indicator for affecting the securities company performance. And let's move on the fixed income corporate bond markets. You may heard about the new regulation, very important, Decree 65, for governing the corporate bond under private placement. And it's a very too good to be true, actually, for Vietnamese bond market. After very small and thin issuance activity from January this year, only banks, credit institution, namely banks, they issue, and some real estate developers, they issue. Remaining is a very inactive. And that's question about the earnings quality and the outlook of Vietnamese securities company, especially the company who rely on the income from the fixed income market and the risk associated with from the bond trading and underwriting activities by those securities company. And in the later section, we could discuss more about that. But I would like to say there are some good news and bad news with the new regulation. The good news is that the market will be better in terms of transparency and the standard for the issuing the bonds. But the bad news is that the standard for qualified investor, or we sometimes call a professional investor, is increasing. And it's the average 2 billion for 6 months. It's not only 1 day or some point of time during they have the investment accounts. And that makes the demand for bond investment reduce, we think, in the short run. So that could be not something expected from securities company. But I think in the long run, it's a good for the market, for the bond market, because we need really the more institutional investor or the individual, but who understand the risk appetite and the risk of default. And the quality of the bonds they're investing in is not only based on the coupon or the interest rate and make the investment decision. And of course, some good news for us about the mandatory ratings with a certain condition. So whenever the issuer, Vietnamese company who issue the bond with value, the total value more than 500 billion, around 20 million US dollar, and the total value of the bond over the past 12 months, more than 50% of its equity. That's the first condition. And the second condition, if the bond exposure is more than 1 times of equity, they need to be rated by credit rating agency, including us. So we hope with the rating regulation, we will support the market more transparent and support you as an investor, have preferences in your risk management, selection of the bond to invest, and pricing. So let's talk about, in that context, how the financial leverage of Vietnamese securities company are right now. So we look at the assets over equity. It's about 2.2 times by the end of June this year. And if you look at the exhibit number 5 here, the equity base of the Vietnamese securities company has been increasing a lot, especially over the last 2 or 3 years. And some people say it's very, alarming level, because they look back the last financial crisis, 2008. But we think differently, because now the earning model of the Vietnamese securities company is not only based on the prop trading, it's not only based on the easy margin lending anymore, and they have a quite diversified source of earning. So we think it's everything under the control in general. Of course, there are a number of companies who have the leverage much more than this level and close to the maximum ceiling imposed by the State Securities Commission, but many other is still, under reasonable level, safe level, we think. And talking about this, I would like to hear some view or some sharing from Anh Paul, from your experience when working with S&P, and especially rating the top investment banking and securities company in the world. So sharing some view about this. Do you think it is highly leveraged, or what degree of risk for Vietnamese securities company based on this information and your experience in working with our team when doing the rating for Vietnamese company? Anh Paul, please. Couldn't hear you, Anh Paul.
Need to be, thanks.
Okay.
Thanks, Mr. Tuan. Yes, this is an interesting slide, and no doubt Prachi will talk some more about the fundamentals of brokerage companies. But obviously, brokerage companies live in an unstable environment, and as the markets rise and fall, so do brokerage earnings, and at the same time, probably margin lending revenues will fall as well. So brokerage firms around the world are in an inherently unstable environment, and that reflects on the way we think about these companies. However, if you look at the gearing that's indicated in this slide, in the scheme of things, if you compare this gearing with finance companies, consumer credit companies, and indeed compare it with other brokerages overseas, it's actually quite a conservative level of gearing. If you think about the, say, Lehman Brothers, when it defaulted during the global financial crisis, its leverage at that time was around 25 times to 1, so not 2.5 times. So I'd keep that in the level of gearing and its movement up in context. Certainly, the brokerage business is very cyclical, but as we look along with Prachi and the rest of the team, Mr. Kwan, we do look at the ability of these companies to manage their costs during a downturn. As you mentioned before, we look at their diversification of income streams, but in the scheme of things, I think this is actually quite a, for the average, quite a conservative level of gearing. And when you're looking at these companies, you do need to look at the individual company, of course, not just at that level of gearing, but also their risk appetite as they go about margin lending, as they structure their business to, can ask the question, can they deal with the volatility in brokerage and other forms of income? So on the face of it, I don't see this movement in gearing over the past 2 or 3 years particularly concerning because it's off really quite a low base. I think the focus for the securities firms really ought to be on their individual practices and the individual risk management processes for each segment of their business.
Thank you.
Perhaps Prachi wants to provide a broader context there.
Prachi, you have some quick sharing on from your perspective on the financial leverage of the Vietnamese securities companies.
Right. No, thanks, Mr. Thorn. As Paul mentioned, I agree that the gearing levels that we look at in Vietnam are fairly conservative compared to what we see in other countries. And, they in fact would be at a much lower level than what you would see in, let's say, in India or other Asian countries, which would probably be around 4.5 times. Yeah.
Thank you, Prachi. It's good to see Vietnamese securities company under some reasonably low leverage comparing to somewhere else. But of course, yes, it depends on individual company situation. We will discuss later. So let me move on. This charts, I think, very important, and we have few messages would like to share with you. People, investor in the stock market now normally think the Vietnamese securities company, domestic, I mean, not only the Vietnamese, but we have a lot of foreign securities company here, the Koreans and the other foreigners. I think the prop trading still now very at the small scale, but unfortunately, when you look at the earnings contribution, the income contribution, we still think it's prop trading still contributing a significant portion and the largest over the past 7 or 10 years for the income of Vietnamese or securities companies. So that's we think based with the current market condition, especially the sideways of the index performances and the very low liquidity, there will be some impact for the credit performance of the securities company currently and in the time to come. But the good thing is that margin lending becoming more part of the cake, and of course brokerage service as well. So having said that, the market risks, the index performance, and the outlook in the time to come will be one of the key factors. We are watching the market and how its impact for the performance of securities company, and some weak company is about the liquidity issue as well, among the other factors. And it's worth to note here advisory or underwriting service, especially with the bond market, but the income still small, and we hope in the outlook in the next 1 or few years more to come, the asset management and the underwriting service, the earnings from those activity will increase further, and we will discuss in the later section about that. How about the profitability? So of the Vietnamese securities sector, we used to have a very high performing years. 2021 return on equity on average about 21%, very high comparing to regional peers, and higher than the banking sector as well, and much higher than many other financial sector. But in the first half of this year, it's already down to half of that. So what should be the next prospect by the end of this year and next year? We don't think it will be come back. It will be back to 20 or 21% soon. But let's talk more about in the later section, and what should be the key risks we need to monitor. And one thing to mention about when talking about the profitability of the financial sector players like securities company is worth to look at the cost to income ratio. So in the figure number 7, so it's around 49% and tend to be increasing. So that's another indicator we are looking at. And of course, we observe depends on the company and the business model. Some company, they have very low cost to income ratio, especially they apply the technology and digital brokers. But some other coming up like 60% or even 70%. So depends on the distribution and depends on the company by companies. But on overall, if you look at the first half of this year and the outlook for this year, I think securities company, they have a very tough year and difficult years, I think, to come. And about the funding profile and liquidity, one of the issue of Vietnamese securities company is that they rely on very short-term funding a lot. So that's the issue. And if you look at the long-term debt, only 3% of the total capital mobilization, including the equity. So of course, the short-term funding from our research is used for the margin lending mostly. So given the current market low sentiment and low liquidity, so that's one of the key risks we are looking at, especially the liquidity for some smaller companies. And as Paul mentioned previously, it's a good news that financial leverage of the securities company is much better than the financial institution. Of course, the banks and non-banks institution, they have a strict regulation oversight as well. But financially and from the risk perspective, we think the capital buffer from securities company in a good safe for now. In summary, my section, I would like to summarize the 5 key headwinds or the risk for Vietnamese securities company in the time to come, and we will make it clearer in the later section. But firstly, it's about low liquidity. That's affecting the broker's income and especially the credit quality of the margin loans given to their clients, and affecting the new share issue plan. Many companies, they have a plan, but given the market condition, they suspended. So that's one issue we are looking at. The second, the sideways performances of the index. So that's make the prop trading portfolio more vulnerable to the market condition, and of course the quality of the margin lending as well, especially the company who pump money for speculative stocks and small and liquidity stocks. And thirdly, very important, especially some of you from securities companies, so you already observed how the impact from tightening monetary policy from the banks with some regulation for financial assets, including for the stock market. So, and in the meantime, the Vietnamese company, they borrow mostly from the banks. Of course, some company, they issue the foreign currency debt, but still very highly reliant on the banking credits, the credit line from the banks. So the policy developments having impact on this as well. At least just not easy to borrow from the new money from the banks. Of course, at this condition, we don't think that the demand from securities company to borrow more could be big enough. And fourthly, it's about the high high interest rate environment you heard about from globally and from the Vietnamese market, and the depreciation of the Vietnamese dong, which affecting the cost of funding from the Vietnamese securities company, who are borrowing from the banks, who are borrowing from overseas, and who issuing the corporate bond as well. So this something depends, of course, depends on the company by company, and depends on the level of exposure. So that's something we are looking at. But in general, is one of the headwinds we believe the companies are facing. And lastly, the policy correction in the corporate bond market over the from the early this year, affecting the corporate performance, the earnings, and the I believe the liquidity of some smaller and weak company as well, because of the the financing the bond and selling the bond to the market, and they are buying back together with the issuer for the early redemption. So that's buying back the bonds. The Vietnamese securities company, they need some sort of funding. So that's affecting the financial leverage and financial situation of the Vietnamese securities company as well. So that's the key highlights, and we will discuss more in the later section by components and by group of companies.